I make lifestyle and travel content. And I actually make a little bit of Disney content because I used to work at Disney Cruise Line. I worked there for about 9 months, almost a year ago. And it was just one of like the most amazing experiences of my life. I've always wanted to work for Disney, and I kind of went to the audition on a whim and ended up booking the contract and taking it, and it was such a whirlwind of a time, but it was amazing. If you're curious, I did work in entertainment, which again was super wonderful. It's like a thing that I've always wanted to do, so it's amazing that I got to experience that. But that being said, when I first got my contract, there were so many questions that I had. There were so many questions about, you know, working in entertainment and so many different things that there really weren't any resources out there. And it was just something that I kind of wish that I had. So I'm here to just kind of talk about pros and cons and advice and like things that I wish I had known. So let's get started. My second piece of kind of advice that I can give is to make friends with people outside of your department. And people tell you this like no matter what department you're in. People's like, oh, make friends outside of your department. But for entertainment, I feel like it is especially important because entertainment is the only department where you come in all together and you leave all together. So you spend 9 months of your life with the same 20 to 40 people. So sometimes it's great because you do make really wonderful friends, but a lot of times you find that because you are spending all of your time with these same people get into fights or like different things happen. And so it's good, I at least found it really helpful to have a support system that was outside of the people that I worked with, because it meant that I wasn't spending all of my time with these 20 to 40 people. You work together, you live together, you like party together, you do everything together. So for me, it was really, really nice to have friends that were outside of my department that I could be like, oh my god, this thing happened at work today, and like I could just talk to them about it, and they didn't really know like who my coworkers were, and it was just like a nice space to just like vent. And also it was nice because I wasn't spending all of my time with the same people. So that is something that I found extremely, extremely valuable, is that while I had a lot of great friends in my department, I made some of my best friends outside of my department. When you first get your contract and when you have your first screening call, be really upfront with the person that's doing your call and make sure that you fully understand all parts of your contract, understand the itinerary really well, understand kind of the confines of your role and like different things like that, because I know I've heard of a lot of people kind of getting surprised because they thought that they were going to be traveling to certain areas that they didn't end up traveling to, and then they were disappointed. I think there's this big misconception that people think if you work on a cruise ship, you're going to be like jet setting and like traveling all over the world, which is not untrue, but it just depends on the ship, the itinerary, even the cruise line. So for me, I did get to have some really wonderful travel experiences, and we did have a couple of like specialty cruises here and there, and they were amazing. They were some of like the most amazing travel experiences I've ever had. So I did get to see some really beautiful places, but the majority of my itinerary was actually visiting the same like 5 to 10 islands every 2 weeks. And then we would have like a few weeks out of the 6 months that we were on the ship that were specialty cruises that we would then get to see new ports, and then we would obviously like go on port adventures and explore. But just know that a lot of the times you might be seeing the same islands over and over and over again, and it's not exactly that super crazy, you're traveling somewhere new every day, at least at Disney Cruise Line. So just be really clear with whoever's doing your screening call of like, okay, so like what can I really expect out of this itinerary? Am I going to be going to the same 2 islands every 3 days? Am I going to be my itinerary personally was alternating, so we would go to one set of islands one week, we'd go to the Western Caribbean one week, and then the Eastern Caribbean the other week, and then again we had those specialty cruises every now and then. But yeah, I just think it's one of those things where I've seen a lot of people get surprised when they realize that they're not going to be waking up on a new island every day. So it's just worthwhile being really honest with your recruiter and being like, hey, what can I expect out of this? Same thing with your role. I know for me, that was a thing that I kind of had a little bit of culture shock when I first started rehearsals. I was like, oh, I thought I was going to be doing, you know, more so of this kind of role rather than this. And like, just be really honest and be really upfront with your recruiter and ask them, you know, what you can expect out of your role, what you can expect out of opportunities for growth and things like that. Again, I ended up actually loving the way that my role turned out, and I ended up at the end loving my job. But when I first got to rehearsals, it was just a little different than I was expecting. So that's just something to keep in mind and to really be super honest with your recruiter about, so that you're not surprised when you show up to Toronto for rehearsals. My number one, this is kind of a pro and a con at the same time, and it's specific to working in entertainment, is entertainment cast members on Disney Cruise Line are actually really lucky in that we get a lot of access to guest area. Some other departments kind of have to stay more within crew area or only allowed in certain parts of guest area. But for entertainment, it's actually really wonderful because we get to spend a good chunk of time in guest area. We get to eat in guest area, which is really nice. The food is really tasty. But kind of the flip side to that is that there are a lot of rules around like what you need to wear if you're going to be in guest area, where you can sit, what times you can go, things like that. So while it is such a privilege, we are absolutely appreciative of the privilege that we have. That is one thing to keep in mind, especially by the end of the contract. Sometimes you're just like, I just want to eat pizza in my pajamas. But that's like not a thing that happens on cruise line. It's like if you want pizza, you either, you know, have to wait till a specific time to go to the crew mess and eat it in your pajamas in the crew mess, or you have to like get dressed up and look nice and then go to guest area and get pizza. And it's like, there's just a lot more rules. Another one of the, like, if you go to a restaurant in guest area at any point, like they can ask you to move in order to accommodate guests and things like that, which like obviously makes so much sense, and like guests come first, and it is a privilege that we get to be in guest area at all. But it's just one of those things where sometimes you're like, man, like this would never happen to me, you know, in the real world. But in the real world, you also like wouldn't get to eat such wonderful food for free. So it's just, it's a lot of a give and take. Working on a cruise ship really teaches you a lot of self-reliance. Obviously, you don't have tons of access to Wi-Fi, so having that shoulder to lean on is a little different when you're on a ship. Obviously, you have your coworkers and you have your friends, but it's just a little bit different. You know, you don't have that instant gratification, that instant communication. And also, for me specifically, because I did have so many friends that were outside of my department, it meant that a lot of times they would be working when I was off in port, which I actually ended up really not minding. I didn't mind getting off in port alone and just like going and exploring, and just like kind of listening to myself and like spending time with myself, if that makes sense, which is something that was a little bit of an adjustment at first. I think it's really easy when you get on a ship and you don't have access to talk to your family or talk to your friends back home. It's really easy to feel lonely and alone. But I actually grew to enjoy my time alone so much, and I would like spend hours on deck just reading by myself. I would go off in port and go to like places that no one else wanted to go to. I remember in, I think it was Martinique, the one place that I just like desperately wanted to go to was their library. They have this just beautiful library, and none of my friends wanted to go, so I was like, you know what, I'll go on my own. Obviously, especially in ports that you're not familiar with, you have to be careful. Don't get into any weird taxis or anything, be careful. But being on the ship did teach me a lot about self-reliance, and it just like really taught me to kind of enjoy my time alone. Another kind of pro to ship life is that you do actually get to save a good chunk of money, which for me as a college student at the time was extremely helpful, especially if you're smart about how you're spending your money on the ship. You know, if you're not spending tons of money on Wi-Fi or drinks, or if you're being smart when you're getting off in port, and not going on like crazy port adventures and stuff, which I mean, sometimes you can actually get those port adventures either free or discounted depending on like what the port adventures audits look like, which is something that you'll figure out when you get to the ship. But yeah, especially if you're smart about how you're spending your money aboard, you can save a good chunk of money, which is really nice. For me, one of the few cons to being on the ship was that things were just a little bit more complicated than they would be in the real world, if that makes sense. Like what I mentioned with, you know, getting to eat in guest area. In the real world, you would be able to just order pizza and sit in your bed and eat your pizza. That's not the case on a ship. If you want pizza, it's a whole ordeal. But it goes beyond that too. You know, if you want to go to the grocery store, you kind of can't. I mean, we have cruise shop on the ship and it has kind of snacks, drinks, and like a few toiletries. But it's one of those things where you're like, okay, well, if I want like actual groceries, I need to like wait for this one specific day on this one specific port and like be able to go to this one specific grocery shop. Or, you know, I might have to wait until we're in Florida and then I have to like take a bus or take an Uber, and it's like a whole, everything just becomes much more complicated. Or with Wi-Fi, sometimes you're like, okay, so I need to send an email. In the real world, you could just send an email. If it had an attachment, you could just send an email with an attachment, with a picture, and it wouldn't matter. But on the ship, because you have to pay for Wi-Fi, then trying to send an email with an attachment or a photo or anything like that becomes much more complicated. So you're like, okay, well, I need to like find Wi-Fi so I can send this email. And again, it becomes a whole ordeal. You're like, well, I have to go through security to get off the ship, to then walk 15 minutes to that Starbucks because that Starbucks has better Wi-Fi because all the tourists are at this Starbucks. And again, it just becomes like much more of a process. So again, in the grand scheme of things, you're getting to travel, you're getting to experience new places. It's not terrible, but again, by the end of the contract, once you've been there for 6 months, it starts to feel a little bit like, man, I just want to be a normal person. And I think with that, with like wanting to feel like a real person, I think sometimes it can be really easy to feel really like just disconnected from the real world, because you're, especially for me, I study political communications at college. I'm really kind of politically involved. And so it was hard to feel like I was just super disconnected from all that. One of the things that helped me on the ship to feel like a normal person is that we do actually get TV, and depending on like where you were, sometimes it wouldn't work and stuff if you were like in a weird spot and couldn't get a signal. But for the most part, we got TV, and so I would actually watch the news, which I know a lot of my coworkers and my friends were like, why? But for me, it really helped me feel kind of like I was a part of the real world and part of a kind of just like a normal person. But that's something that I definitely experienced a lot, especially towards the end of my contract, was like I don't really feel like connected to the real world, and I don't really feel like a real adult human, if that makes sense. Another way that actually one of my coworkers described it was sometimes ship life feels a little bit like summer camp, especially because, you know, you have roommates, you live in bunk beds, you don't really have that like adult autonomy of getting up and going somewhere, that full independence, because at the end of the day there are a lot of different rules that you have to follow, and at the end of the day your managers and the higher ups on the ship can they have a good amount of control over what happens. So those are really my only two cons, was that a lot of times I didn't feel like a real adult, and I missed that autonomy, and I missed kind of the convenience of things. I remember when I got back to Boston, going to CVS was like mind-blowing, because I was like, you mean to tell me that if I need things, I can just go get them. I can just walk to the CVS down the street and get them. Because on the ship, again, it's a little more complicated, or especially Target. Port Canaveral is one of those places that, like, the only thing in Port Canaveral is cruise ship ports. So for you to go to Target was like an ordeal. And I remember coming back to Boston after my contract and being like, oh my God, I can get on the train. I can just go to Target. And it's not going to cost me, you know, a $40 Uber to go to Target. So it's just little things like that, and just like different convenience things that you kind of start to miss when you've been on the ship for a while. On the whole, I had a wonderful experience, and I wouldn't trade my 9 months that I worked at Disney Cruise Line for the world. But I did have a big adjustment period. I would say the first like 3 months of my contract, I felt really lonely. I didn't really know if I'd made the right choice. I was just feeling a little insecure. I was questioning a lot of things. And these are just things that I wish someone had told me. And especially because at that point, you know, nobody that I really knew had done anything like this. My family obviously didn't know. And so one of the things that they would tell me was to just be like, oh, we'll just like stick it out. And I'm so glad they did, because after those first 3 months that were really tough was when it got really good, and I feel like I made wonderful friends and got to travel to some really beautiful places. So every day I thank my lucky stars that they told me to just stick it out. But I do wish that I'd had a little bit more of that advice and a little bit more of a shoulder to lean on, and someone to kind of answer all of these questions. So if you guys have any more questions, do let me know. I'm willing to answer as much as I can. Leave comments below if you have any kind of lingering questions, if you're wondering about anything, or if you want me to make more cruise line videos. I'd be more than happy to, kind of about different specific aspects about crew life, about what auditioning for entertainment was like, what my process was in terms of getting hired, all of these different things. I am here for you guys, because I know that very little of these existed when I first got my contract. So thank you so much for watching. Leave me any questions you have below, and thank you so much.